Hi everyone, welcome to this latest video on artist films, and today we're going to do something new. We're going to be exploring the Russian war losses. We're going to analyze the Russian losses from 2022 to 2025, and for this I have prepared some slides. So first, before we go deep into the topic, there's some sources and assumptions. So the main source for this analysis is WarSpotted. We're also using CSIS and The Economist data, since they also have some interesting data points on the Russo-Ukrainian war. Since 2022, WarSpotted collects seasonal data, and I'm going to aggregate it to annual data as well. Also the winter, which is a season which goes across 2 years every time. I've always added winter into 1 year. For example, the winter of 24 to 25 has simply been aggregated into 2025 for simplicity's sake. So throughout this presentation, that's something to bear in mind. Also note that the 2022 winter data is a very low intensity moment since the war started on February 22. Another assumption, or another topic to bear in mind, the 2025 data, we have the actuals to mid-year on WarSpotted, and so I'm going to extrapolate that to full year, assuming a continued similar rate of attrition on the Russian side. And then finally, something very important on WarSpotted is to note that this data on WarSpotted does not include civilian vehicles. What does that mean? So motorbikes are not counted, scooters, cars, loafs, vans, all of these types of vehicles which we see being destroyed a lot recently on the front. Well, these are all no longer relevant, or not. These are not tracked. So let's dive straight into the analysis. So on the second slide here, we can see the annual losses. What does this mean? It means destroyed or captured, categorized by year. So this is a very interesting graph. We see it starts with 8,044 vehicles captured and destroyed in 2022. That's the initial invasion. Then a sharp drop of almost 50% into 2023 at 4,000 vehicles. Then a serious increase by 51% again in 2024. And then a sharp drop again down into 2025. And here you see the 2025 actuals and then the 2025 estimate, right? So estimate what we expect will be lost by the end of 2025. So if you look at these phases of the war, in 2022, we have huge losses because it was obviously the initial invasion. And this was the phase in which we saw the majority of the Russian gains. But this was quickly followed by a Ukrainian counteroffensive along the entire northern front, Kherson, Kharkiv, and these resulted in enormous losses on the Russian side. And then, so this is the phase of the war where, for example, I also added what phase of the drone war we're in, where recon drones and drop drones were used at scale already. As a result of the 2014 to 2022 war or phase of the war, there had already been some drone technology utilized. In 2023, we see the stalemate. So we enter a stalemate phase where gains are no longer, the front is no longer pushing forward and backward massively all the time. And so that we enter the attritional phase of the war, which we are still in right now. This is when the Battle of Bakhmut ends in 2023. And at this stage, FPV drones are used at scale. So this is a new technology that's being used at scale by now. In 2024 is the phase when really the Russian offensives ramp up again. So the pace of the grind is being scaled up on the Russian side. So the pressure mounts. This is when the Battle of Avdiivka ends. And Avdiivka was sort of a trigger point for an increased pace of Russian gains, albeit small gains, continued gains, all the way until today, right? And here we have the scaling of long-range drones. So the start of the campaigns where Ukraine and Russia are shooting long-range drones at each other's cities and infrastructure. And we also see drone battalions becoming a thing at this stage of the war. And now we're in 2025, and when you look at these numbers, it's actually very shocking. This is the phase in the war where the least amounts of vehicles have been destroyed or captured. Up to now, 2,840. That's way less than in any other year of the war. When we look at the upper end estimate of 2025, I say upper end estimate because actually each season of 2025, the amount of losses have decreased. We're going to see this later on, but I've taken the average of that and extrapolated it upwards, right? So that's why it's an upper end estimate, whereas the nitty-gritty details, if we chop that 2025 up in seasons, illustrates a complete decline, a non-stop decline, right? So we see a massive decrease in the pace of the Russian offensive. Based on this data, you would say either the Russians are attacking at half the pace of 2024, or the Ukrainians are unable to destroy Russian vehicles anymore, right? So that would be the two potential conclusions of this data. When we look at the next slide, this is now no longer a look at an annual view of losses. This is a view based on seasons. And why did I do this? I wanted to explore the concept of the seasonality of warfare. Before or as the war began, people kept saying, well, during the winter, the war is going to slow down. But during the spring or during the rainy season, the Rasputitsa, this muddy season, the war is going to slow down. Oh, it will slow down then. No, it will slow down then. And so I wanted to take a look at that. And based on the seasonality data, you can clearly see spring and autumn are by far the deadliest seasons of the war. Spring and autumn. So, but if we look a bit deeper, if we exclude for 2022, that's the green bar at the bottom of each of these seasons, there's actually no season that jumps out as being in any way different. Bear in mind that the autumn season doesn't show any 2025 data yet. That's why it's slightly lower than all the others if you would remove the green bar. But so in essence, one conclusion one could make is seasonality of warfare a thing of the past? You know, back in the medieval times, you would have warfare based on seasons because of, right, you cannot go to war in winter when there's no food, when it's too cold. But now it seems that might be a thing of the past. If you disagree or if you think there's other reasons, please write it down in the comments below. I'm curious, but based on the data, that would be sort of the main conclusion I would make there, that seasonality of warfare, is it still a thing? And looking at this data, we can conclude that 2022 is followed by a major consolidation on the Russian side, right? Followed by a gradual push starting in summer of 2023, right? So yellow is 2023. We see that the winter and spring of 2023, really low activity. But as of the summer of 2023, so the yellow bar, that bar starts thickening into 2024. It culminates in autumn of 2024, and then it tapers down into 2025. And so summer of 2025, we can conclude has the lowest amount of losses. But as I said, civilian vehicles do not get counted on war spotting. So we would say summer of 2025 is the least armored phase of the war, right? We have a lot of potential blind losses. Civilian vehicles would be blind. On war spotting, these are not tracked. And, right, are tanks and IFVs slowly being replaced by civilian vehicles? Or has Ukrainian targeting reduced drastically, right? Those are the two conclusions or the two questions one would have to ask themselves. On the next slide, this is a slide I really like. It shows you all of the data before, right? All of the war spotting data openly. right? We see each of the colors represents a different type of vehicle that war spotting collects data on. It's very confusing. There's not enough colors in the color palette on PowerPoint to really represent these accurately. But I've marked some of the most important ones, like tanks in orange, green for transport, yellow for command posts, especially in the beginning of the war. Lots of command posts were getting destroyed during this movemental phase of the war. And then gray for IFEs, which is a category which really explodes, especially in 23-24. And so here we again see that this beginning phase of the war, right? We have the Russian initial gains in the winter and the spring of 2022. And this is quickly followed by the Ukrainian counters. First of all, the massive retreat along the entire northern front, Kiev, Chernihiv, Sumy, probably forgetting some regions up in the north where the Russians completely pulled out and abandoned and lost a ton of equipment, but then also followed by the retreats and the counteroffensives into Kharkiv, which resulted in another insane amount of Russian losses, and Kherson, of course, which was probably the more organized retreat of all of those Russian retreats, right, out of the regions. So this is the insane amount of losses that occurred then, and we drop off steeply from this Ukrainian counteroffensive phase right into what I call the recuperation phase. So the gray phase, here we see the lowest amount of losses throughout the entire time. I believe this might also be when the Ukrainians tried this failed counteroffensive in Zaporizhia along Robotine, however you pronounce it. I like to say Robodine, but it's Robotine. And then this was flipped as of, if you look at summer 2023, the numbers start jumping up, 40% increase. That's the Russian new offensive, the new phase, the attritional phase really kicks off then. And we see losses of 1,200 per season, grinding up into 1,600 in spring 2024. And again, 1,600, again, 1,000, almost 700 in autumn of 2024. This is this huge grinding phase that we saw last year, trying to recapture also the region trying to recapture the regions of Russia that Ukraine had entered in Kursk. And we see IFEs are a big thing there. And then we see a steep drop-off. So from autumn 2024, we see a 34% drop down to 1,100. Again, a drop of 10% to 993. And then now by minus 42%, right? With an estimate of 579 based on the current loss data. So that is an insane loss if you compare it to just 4 seasons ago, almost 1,700 armored vehicles on the Russian offensive being lost per season, all the way down to 500 and let's say 600 in total. So that's 1/3 of the losses. And so the question is, continued grind, but with what? Right? We know there is a continued Russian push because the Russian front is moving forward, but with what are they moving forward? Because they're not moving forward with tanks anymore. The IFE numbers have dropped off entirely. All of the armored Soviet inheritance seems to be disappearing, right? So it seems to be disappearing. It's not disappearing, it's just being blown up on the front. So again, there's just not enough of it. And that, you know where this is going. This is being replaced by civilian vehicles, but that's really quite shocking when you look at it graphically, how this armored push of 2024 and all the seasons before it has completely disappeared off of here. One thing to note, it might be that all of these vehicles, the Soviet backlog or the Soviet inheritance has been entirely burnt through or majoritarily burnt through, but it might also be that we're looking at, again, this winter 2022-23 and spring 23, where there were also very low losses compared to the seasons before. This was actually a Russian preparation for the next big Russian push and counteroffensive, right? So there's multiple conclusions one could make off of this. So in the next slide here, we again see the annual losses categorized by equipment type per year. So this is an aggregated view. We again see the 50% drop from 22 to 23, 50% increase in 24, and then the hard 40% drop into 2025. But these are too many categories. It's too confusing. The colors are being reused. So if we look at the next slide, on slide number 7, we have annual losses categorized by equipment type per year, simplified, right? And here we see that the categories that I kept, because they were large enough and important enough, are rocket and missile artillery, infantry mobility vehicles, self-propelled artillery, drones, others. I aggregated everything else into others. Everything that I kicked out from the previous slide, I aggregated into others. Tanks are an important category. Transport are a very important category, especially in 2022, but completely dropped off afterwards. And then infantry fighting vehicles are the most important category throughout the war. So let's dig into the raw data, right? On this side, we see the absolute growth and decrease of loss types throughout the years. So on the left side, we see the loss types, the different types of vehicles that are tracked on war spotting. And then vertically, we see each year, 2022, 23, 24, 25, estimated end of year numbers. And then colored, we see the growth of each year versus the previous year. That's why there's no growth after 2022, because there's no previous year in the war to compare it to. But so let's go through this line by line. The tanks in 2022 lost were 1,300. This dropped by 40% down to 790 in 23, and then grew again by 52% in 24 to 1,200. So almost 22 levels in the Russian attritional phase of the war. And then what we see in 2025, complete drop off. So lowest levels into the war so far, just 579 tanks expected. That's a 50% decrease, or over 50% decrease. When we look at rocket and missile weaponry, so these rocket and missile vehicles, in 2022 we're at 151, 155, 23, so no big difference. 129, again no big difference. And then 111 in 2025, again no big difference. So here, not really a huge difference. I guess these are behind the line, so they're not suffering as much from the war so far. And that's why we see a pretty consistent level of losses for this specific vehicle type. Transport is an interesting one. We see 2,000 plus losses in 2022. And then the rest of the years, a pretty similar level of 600 to 500 losses. This is because of in 2022, if you remember, in the north, there were these long traffic lines that you could see from space. I'm pretty sure a lot of those losses come from being able to do bombing runs on these transports that you could see from space. And any partisan in northern Ukraine knew where these were, and they were just stuck there essentially, and you could shoot artillery onto them. And then I also suspect because of the really quick Russian retreats out of certain regions, this is the first vehicle type that you're probably gonna ditch, right? It's just a truck essentially. So the Ukrainians probably captured a lot of those. Then we come to the IFVs, infantry fighting vehicles. These are used by the Russians to get really close to the front line, right up into the face of the Ukrainian trenches. And it keeps the soldiers relatively safe because it's an armored vehicle. It even has a cannon, right? And so it's able to be offensive, and it also defends the people inside. So it's able to protect the Russian soldiers all the way until it reaches really the enemy trenches. And that's why it's such an important vehicle in this war, because of the nature of the war. You keep having to push to the next row of tree lines and trenches, next tree line, and these things really, I guess, increase the survivability of your soldiers quite significantly and can transport a lot of soldiers in the back. So in 2022, 2,500 losses. In 2023, minus 45%, down to 1,300. Huge numbers, by the way. And then in 2024, when the real Russian grind restarted, an increase of 120% to 3,026. In 2025, that dropped already down by 44%, down to 1,700. That's still higher than 2023, but it's a huge drop off from the peak from 2024, which is a peak which even surpasses the 2022 initial invasion, right? This is I believe right now, probably the most important vehicle type in the Russian arsenal due to the type of warfare they're waging. And they're running through these at an insane pace, I believe. Because then we see the infantry mobility vehicle. These are less armored than the IFVs, and these are relatively low throughout the war, but we're seeing an uptick in them. I'm not going to go through each of the numbers, but we see an uptick in 2025, as I believe these are being used as a replacement for the significant losses in the IFV category. So right now, they're taking as many vehicle types as they can to replace the losses in the IFE and to be able to keep the grind going forward. Then, self-propelled artillery, SPGs, very important vehicle type. Significant losses in 22 and 23 at 300, but a steep drop-off in 24 and 25. And I'm not exactly sure why that is. Either they're running out, or the Ukrainians are being less successful at hitting these, which surprises me because the war... The front line of the war is no longer just this World War I style no man's land, right? With the advent of drones, the no man's land is extending kilometers behind and in front of the front line, and you're not safe if you're behind the trenches anymore. You have a huge death zone behind and in front of the front lines due to how far the FPV drones can fly. The recon drones can fly. The FPV drones that have the cables, so you cannot block the signals off of these drones. So that's actually surprising for me, and I'm not sure why that is. Then drones, next category, makes sense. Huge increases over the years. But again, here I'm surprised that in 2025, using current data, we have a slight drop-off in 2024 versus 2024, which is the peak moment. I believe these are these coming from the videos that you often see of drones intercepting drones high up in the air. But yeah, I am surprised that this number is expected to be lower by the end of 2025. I would expect it to actually be far higher in 2025, given what we know about the front line. I'm not going to go into others, but the final interesting category is aircraft and helicopters. So massive losses on the Russian frontier in year 1, 2022, at 124 aircraft and helicopters lost. Dropped by 50% to 64 in 23. Again, 50% in 24. Almost no losses on the Russian side in 24. And then a huge increase by 104% versus 2024 to 61%. I did not estimate that upward, by the way, because this is from the Operation Spiderweb. And so this is the only number that I didn't extrapolate upwards. It would be cheating in a way because, Spiderweb is a unique thing that happened in which they managed to destroy an insane amount of aircraft and helicopters subsequently in various operations. So that equates 2023, and I think for the Ukrainians that is a very, very good result, especially considering the 2024 numbers. So if we take a look at the overall, we see the same story, right, as shown in the previous slide. So I'm not going to go into that. Now we've seen the absolute numbers, but what is very important also is the composition, right? The composition of the units throughout the war. And so you would expect, or my expectation is 2022 was the ideal Russian composition for this war, right? They were fully prepared, fresh units, highly trained units. The vehicles were the best of the best that they had. It was planned since a long time. And so I expect 2022 to accurately depict what, according to the Russians, is the perfect mix of vehicle types. So we see 16% tanks, 27% transport, 31% IFVs, and yeah, that seems to be, according to the Russians, the perfect composition. Then going through the years, we see a, first of all, steep drop-off in transport, and that's because after 2022, transports did not get destroyed and lost anymore. It somewhat blurs whether 2022 was really the ideal composition. But then when we look in 2024, we see that 50% of the vehicles were IFVs, right? So it really shows how important this unit type is as a percentage of the force. 11% were transport, so a significant decrease, which again gives us the hint that perhaps that was not the ideal composition in 2022. It was simply because the Ukrainians managed to get so deep behind the Russian lines and make the retreat so quick that they captured so many transport vehicles. Tanks at 19%, right? So we can say, okay, based on this, in 2024, there was not yet that many civilian vehicles being used. 19% tanks, 49% IFVs, 4% drones. The drone number as part of the composition keeps increasing every year. That's the green one. SPGs stay fairly constant, and the infantry mobility vehicles keeps going up, right? And so in 2025, the numbers actually don't change that dramatically. Let's take a look at, on the right side, the difference, the change in growth from 2022 to 2025 to identify where the Russian composition has changed the most, right? Maybe this can tell us something about what the Russians think or see, or where the Russians lost the most, right? 2022 being the ideal composition and 2025 being really not the ideal composition after 4 years of war. So we see a 56% increase in rocket and missile artillery as a percentage of the force. 74% increase in infantry mobility vehicles as a percentage of the force. That is a huge increase, by the way. Again, these IMVs are being brought in more and more, I believe, to replace losses in IFVs. SPGs down 8%. That's not a big change. Drones, the biggest growth, 125% growth. Aircraft and helicopters, no big change. Tanks, no big change in terms of the composition. Transport, significant decrease. IFVs, huge increase, 41% increase in terms of the composition. And then others, a significant decrease. But if we know now, based on all the videos and visual evidence that war spotting is not tracking, that the majority of the Russian offensive is currently being performed in 2025 using civilian vehicles, and here on the slide we see examples of these. These are Loafs, Ladas, motorbikes. That's something we know based on visual evidence. And so if we look at this data from The Economist, we see that the estimated total Russian losses are between, let's say, 900,000 casualties to 1.3 million casualties, with an estimate of higher than 1 million casualties. Casualties meaning injured and dead, right? And in terms of deaths, anywhere between, by end of year, almost higher than 200,000 deaths, right? And so when we take the angle of the loss curve, right, and we place them all on, I know this is a hodgepodge job, right? But I mean, if we simply take the angle of the increase in casualties and we place them all over each other, we see that in 2025, that angle is the steepest. And what that means, if the gradient of the red line is so much steeper than the gradients at the beginning of the war in 2022 and 2023, that means that the lethality of the war has changed significantly. And so we know that low armor translates into increasingly severe loss rates, right? And high armor resulted in far lower loss rates. And so if you're attacking a Ukrainian position in a tank or in an IFV, somewhere with lots of armor, the chances of you dying reduce significantly, as opposed to attacking on a motorcycle, where any little bit of shrapnel flying around could take you out of the fight. In an IFV, you're relatively safe from most of those things, right? So we see a significant increase in the lethality of the war on the Russian side, right? Remember, they are the ones attacking, and attacking always is more dangerous and more lethal than defending. And generally, you need a ratio of at least 3 or higher to 1 in order to take over a defending position, right? Because if you're hiding in a trench, it's far easier to defend your position against attackers. And imagine defending your trench against attackers in IFVs versus defending your trench against attackers in sitting on motorcycles or in a Volkswagen van, right? Your bullets go straight through that Volkswagen, and you can defend your position far more easily, right? So it's far more dangerous for a Russian soldier today than at any other time throughout the war to attack an enemy position. And so if we assume that the Russian pace of advance, and going to the next slide now, assuming that the rate of Russian assault is the same, armored losses must be at the very least replaced by at least the same number of non-armored vehicles, right? So the decrease in armored vehicles seen in War Spotted has to be compensated somewhere, right? Somewhere. It's a blind spot for us because it's not being tracked by War Spotted. And that blind spot is approximately 2,400 vehicles at the very least, right? And it could be far more, right? It could be far more, but at the very least, if we assume the Russians are pushing forward at a constant pace, which they are, a very slow, but they are pushing forward, they need to bring to the front line at least that number of civilian vehicles, if not more, given that these vehicles also break down and get destroyed far easier. And so when we look here, we see that the composition from 2024 to 2025 is vastly different. The IFV was king in 2024, and in 2025, the civilian vehicle is king. And when we look at that from a composition perspective, the IFV goes from 49% in 2024, and obviously civilian vehicles were starting to be implemented in 2024, but by far not at the same levels, because 2024 was one of the strongest years in terms of the Russian offensive in terms of armored vehicles. So in 2025, they really need these civilian vehicles. And we see a change from 49% IFVs being king to 39% in 2025, civilian vehicles being king at a minimum 39%, probably far higher. We see IFVs go down to 27%, and we know that the Russians like IFVs to be the largest component of their forces. No longer the case, almost half that. And when we look at transport, also down, but not that significantly. And when we look at tanks are down by half compared to 2024. And also, if you look at the slides before, compared to 2022, compared to any year, tanks are pretty constant. But in 2025, tanks have become a very minor part of the Russian unit composition, right? Drones are growing. Civilian vehicles are growing massively from nowhere into the largest category of vehicles, right? So the absolute number of IFVs dropped from 3,000 to 1,686. Right, and this completely flips the picture on the total unit composition of the Russians' offensive. Returning to this slide, looking at the Russo-Ukrainian war, we can say that the de-armorization of the Russian offensive is both absolute as well as relative, right? In absolute numbers, the Russians have far fewer numbers to throw at the Ukrainians this year than ever before. But also relatively, whenever a unit is attacking whenever a Russian unit is attacking a Ukrainian unit, that unit is likely to be made up of very few scary tanks, IFVs, etc., and far more of these less scary civilian vehicles, which are relatively easier to defend against. And so when we look at the peaks of each vehicle type, tanks hit their peak in 2023 and 2024 as in terms of its composition. So in those years, 19%, so 2 out of every 10 vehicle that was attacking Ukrainian positions and was destroyed or lost was a tank, right? That is a lot of tanks. In 2024 was the peak of the IFV phase, right? That's not that long ago. 50%, 49%, but let's say 50% of every vehicle that was used to attack a Ukrainian position and destroyed or captured or lost for whatever reason was an IFV. Yeah, and so this was the workhorse of the Russian army. And now, as you see that graph go down, and we know that the Russian offensive, as you see in the background, the losses keep mounting. They're mounting and they're mounting faster than ever before, all right? Higher than 1 million casualties. That means that the grind is happening. The Russians are still attacking, and so this blind spot that we don't see must be there. It's a reality, and this blind spot are the civilian vehicles, which are at a minimum 39%, if not far higher. So now likely at least half the vehicles with which the Russians are moving into the face of the Ukrainians on the front lines are motorbikes, loaves, ladas, and other forms of civilian transportation, right? And that is something very scary, being a Russian infantryman who has to attack a Ukrainian position. So when we look at the phases, we can now identify that this last phase, we can conclude that this last phase is a continued phase, but without armor, right? So we had the Russian grind forward as of 2023. That phase is continuing. It's not stopping. The Russians are still attacking. We can tell that based on the loss data in the graph, which I overlaid here. And we can tell it's still happening. However, and the reason it's increasing is because it's continued, but without armor. Regardless of the vehicle type, the push continues, and that directly translates into more deaths. So we've identified a new phase in the war, and that is that the phase is a continuation, but without armor. But there is also a secondary shift that has occurred very recently. And if we take at this CSIS figure, it depicts the weekly Russian Shahed drone launches, which have surged since September 2024. Right, so this is a very recent change. We can see that before September 2024, there was 10, 20, 50, maybe 100 drones launched every week. And as of September 2024, it averaged at 130 launches per week. It says it there on the graph. And as of September 2024, we see that weekly launches reach 1,100, right? And that's getting worse. It's now mid-July, and every single week and every single day, there's new headlines that the Russians have launched the largest ever attack on Ukraine with drones, right? So what does this mean? If we overlay that on the previous slide where we analyze the phases of the war, we see again the Russian initial gains, then the Ukrainian counteroffensive, then the recuperation phase and a strategic shift by the Russians into the attritional warfare mode, which I wrote here as the Russian grind forward, right? Where we enter these 1,600, 1,700 losses. And then it peters down again. And that's what we call the continued but without armor phase of the war. And this change is exactly or almost exactly at the same moment when we overlay it as when the Russians decided to do a flip. And this flip was a massive investment in the production of drones and missiles to bomb Ukraine. It almost matches one-on-one. Probably in autumn 2024, which was the peak of the Russian grind forward and the last season in which they must have known we can still keep up this pace. They decided at that moment, okay, we know that the offensive is going to become more and more painful. As of now, every single month we will keep losing more people at a weekly rate for each kilometer. It's going to be more and more painful, and it's only going to get more painful. And they decided to make a switch and to try to bomb Ukraine into submission, right? So because of an expectation of, my assumption is, because of an expectation that the gains on the front will be slower and more painful, they decided that it might be better to invest money into a victory by bombing the Ukraine will to fight flat, right? And my expectation here is that it's mid-July 2025 that the number of bombings will simply keep increasing. It's sort of reminiscent of World War II at the point where Hitler realized he was not going to be able to take over Great Britain, and he decided to develop V1 and V2 bombs and hope that the British will surrender simply because he's bombing them, right? But that did not happen. In the end, it had the opposite effect of strengthening the will of the local people, at least in that specific example, to keep fighting. And if we look at the Vietnamese War, the Vietnam War against the Americans, same thing. The Americans tried to bomb the will of the Vietnamese flat, right? But I think it was the most bombed countries in the war are Cambodia and Laos because of that war. And essentially, that didn't stop them to keep fighting. So what is the bigger picture and the conclusions? I tried to come up with some high-level conclusions. Feel free to agree and to disagree. I'm trying to make this as objective as possible, though obviously I am slightly biased towards Ukraine. I'll put that out there. I think that this is a non-justified war, an imperial war. But so let's take a look. What are the main conclusions? Number one, the forward push increases lethality due to lacking or withheld armor, right? I wrote lacking or withheld because it might be possible that they're withholding armor for a new offensive, as they did at the beginning of 2023, and thus is likely to slow down. This realization resulted in a strategic shift to number two. Around the same time, the Russian government massively expanded its Shahid and Geran drone production and bombing campaign. The aim is to break Ukrainian infrastructure and will. I believe that both trends are likely to continue. Ever decreasing use of armor on the front and increasing casualties will translate to a decreasing speed of advances and increasing need for manpower. Increasingly severe bombing campaign on Ukraine will further put strain on Ukraine's war economy and war wariness. The main question is, what breaks first, the Russian or the Ukrainian will to fight? I've been talking for a long time. Not sponsored, but this Schweppes lemon aux saveurs de citron, et citron vert is really good. So, let's continue. I used to play a lot of EU4, and I think that it structures warfare in a very comprehensive way, or comprehensible way. It's sort of a structured approach at looking at warfare. So let's look at it from both sides. On the Ukrainian side, political. Strong backing as seen as an unjust war internationally. On the Russian side, political, no casus belli, and aggressive expansion has resulted in a strong coalition buildup against Russia. This coalition is essentially NATO, which has expanded massively. NATO was essentially created to counter Russia. And so that expanded massively with the addition of Finland and Sweden and many other countries that now decided they suddenly want to become part of NATO. War exhaustion on the Ukrainian side is very high, but is ticking upwards at a slower pace than Russia, right? Because they hit a far higher level because they're being bombed essentially everywhere, and they've had far more losses than as a proportion of their population than Russia has. Whereas on the Russian side, war exhaustion is currently medium. Most Russians are quite spared from this war, and they've done that on purpose. But it's ticking higher and increasingly fast due to increasing speed of losses along many fronts. What are these fronts? It's not just manpower that is being lost at an accelerating pace, but in terms of economic and political influence, Russia is losing a lot of power. In Europe, it has lost almost all power. In terms of political influence, it's no coincidence that Syria happened now with Assad falling. Azerbaijan has taken over Nagorno-Karabakh in two separate wars with Russian soldiers that were standing right there, supposed to protect Armenia with the Russian form of NATO called CSTO. Kazakhstan is flipping between China and Russia. And so essentially everyone is sort of in the old Russian sphere of influence is sort of hedging their bets or moving entirely away. And economically, it's very painful. It hasn't been as painful so far, but it's starting to bite the Russian economy. Obviously, on the Ukrainian side, much worse. What are the Ukrainian war goals? First of all, survival, achieved. And then new goal of reconquest, a very hard war goal to reconquer all the lost territories. On the Russian side, total conquest and annexation has failed, right? That was the initial goal with the full-blown invasion across every front of Ukraine. And then the current war goal is the Donbass plus annexation. Again, very hard. I mean, the pace of moving forward is glacial right now, and at a very high cost. What is the Ukrainian war score? It is negative, but much better than expected, given the win of key battles in the north and liberations of several territories. However, it's now ticking downwards, but quite slowly, right? Because they're losing manpower and losing land, but at a very slow pace. What's the Russian war score? In the first weeks, it was very high. They conquered quite a lot of land, but then crashed by approximately 70%. Because they lost so much land and so much equipment in so many different battles. And as of 2023, when the forward grind phase of the war of attrition started, it was slowly ticking higher again, with 2 or 3 symbolic wins, Bakhmut, Avdiivka since 2022, maybe Vuhledar, you can add that on that list. And so in the bottom, the determining factor will likely be war of exhaustion, as no war goal, in my view, is achievable for either party. The peace deal will be dependent on which party hits maximum war exhaustion first, and subsequently impact the value of the war score and therefore the peace deal, right? So whoever breaks first, essentially the conclusion of the previous side, whoever loses the will to fight first will be the one who will have hit maximum war exhaustion and will therefore be forced to the negotiation table. So Now let's take a look at what Ukraine can and should do in my perspective, and then the next slide, what in my perspective Russia should have done in a very objective way. So what? What can Ukraine do? And my conclusion is they need to do more of what they're already doing. Number one, attrition. Increase that lethality on the front by continue to decrease the armor rate of the Russian offensive, which they've done very successfully so far. This results in more civilian vehicles. When the Russians drive around in civilian vehicles, that results in higher attrition rates and results at some point in highly unpopular political choices for Putin. Does he have to mobilize or not if he wants to keep up the grind? However, would discourage a Ukrainian general offensive as it happened in 2023. This turned the attrition tables against Ukraine and was quite painful for Ukraine. When the enemy is making a mistake, as they were doing in 2022 and as they're doing right now, I would say don't stop them. Let them keep attrit themselves into exhaustion. Secondly, Sky Shield. This is the second part of the Russian strategy, which is let's bomb them into submission. Ukraine has to invest heavily in anti-drone systems, obviously, to blunt the main new Russian strategy of bombing. Much easier for Ukraine to do than for Russia, since it's a smaller country with fewer targets, fewer juicy targets too. Ukraine, I believe, will quickly become a world leader in this technology. Right? If they're able to blunt this bombing attack by the Russians, that will again help Ukraine massively. On the economic side, all of the above, attrition and Sky Shield, need to be economically profitable as we're entering a war of attrition. So here the numbers count. Each drone of the Russians that is shot down, each Shahid that is shot down should be shot down by something that is cheaper on the Ukrainian side, right? Because then you can scale it, and then actually the Russian attack will have been a loss, right? It will be a net economic loss as opposed to a net win. If you shoot down a Shahid with a 10 million missile, that's a win because it didn't explode. But at the same time, it's not something you can keep up on the long run. And right now we're talking long run on everything, right? Then opportunism. I think that Kharkiv, Spiderweb, and Kursk, in my opinion, Kursk, were opportunistic and out-of-the-box ideas, which in my point of view paid off. These are sometimes high-risk move with high potential reward. Number 5, technology. Tied together to number 4 is to maintain Ukraine's innovative spirit alive and even encourage it further. This has been a key strength of Ukraine over Russia. I mean, Ukraine basically won the sea war. They're always ahead in the drone war, although Russians catch up very quickly once they scale. And then they've come up with insanely innovative and technologically opportunistic things like Spiderweb. Yeah, keep doing this. I'm sure they will keep surprising us. And then finally, number 6, political. Ukraine has a lot of backing internationally, but actually Russia has one massive weakness, and that is China. Russia has become highly dependent on China, and Ukraine should find a way, and I don't know how that way is, but to push for a Sino-Russian split, because I believe this might actually be Russia's biggest weakness. And imagine a world where China stops backing the Russian attacks on Ukraine. I believe that will blunt the Russian offensive massively. So I'm not pro-Russia, but I thought to myself, okay, what would I have done if I was Mr. Russia, or if I was playing as Russia in Europa Universalis for here in this situation, right? What would I do in order to win? And essentially, number 1, close. I would close, because the war is actually trending against Russia. When you're stuck in a war where it's trending against you, the best thing to do is close in a quick peace deal, annexing the regions you already have. You should have done this years ago, actually. And because the ground war is going against them, the economic war is starting to bite, and the bombing war will not result in the surrender of Ukraine, but rather harden it further. As I said, I don't think there's many examples, or I can't think of one where bombing someone from far away resulted in them surrendering. And I actually think it has the opposite effect. It actually enrages the other party even more and results in a strengthening of the opposition. So in these situations, I would have gone for a quick close, and I think Putin really had that opportunity at several moments in the war. And then second one, build up. After closing the war, right, he would have annexed quite a large chunk of Ukraine. He should have rebuilt his depleted warfighting capabilities. I mean, you've looked at all the graphs that I've just presented. He's just burnt up an insane amount of Soviet weaponry that has been built up since the 40s, right? So in a very short time, he's managed to lose his entire warfighting capability. And so he should focus on rebuilding that and rebuild an economy. But I would not shift off a war economy if my goal is ultimately to take over Ukraine. So what I would do is I would maintain a war economy, open up the pipelines to Europe somehow again within this peace treaty, rake in the money, reinvest it, rebuild with all of my newfound knowledge about how a 21st century war is waged. And then number three, once all of that is done and once I'm ready, I would strike opportunistically and when international backing for Ukraine is low, right? So at some point, if I was Russia and I have managed to make sure that Ukraine is not protected by NATO or by the EU somehow, or is not entered the EU and has no international troops on Ukraine, if I've managed all of that, because in the beginning of the war, there was no discussion about European troops on Ukraine. This is in discussions now. But in the beginning of the war, Putin had the opportunity to close it in such a way. So when the international backing for Ukraine is low or non-existent, strike again. As they did in 2014 with Crimea, it was a very quick, lightning-fast strike, and it was a fait accompli before anyone in the West could do anything, right? I know it's quite controversial that I'm saying this, but I think that this would have been the best approach for Russia if it wants to win long-term. And I think it's important to identify that because it also better prepares Ukraine in the long run, if they want to survive as a nation, is to prepare for what a worst case scenario Russia would be like. Thankfully, they don't have a worst case scenario Russia. This would be a worst case scenario Russia. It's a smart Russia that closes, rebuilds up its military capability and strikes again. Closes, rebuilds up, strikes again, and maybe one of those strikes will be the final strike, right? That would be the worst case. What did Russia do instead? So what it did, Trump. His latest opportunity, right? Putin should have done a close and he should have actually done it earlier in the war. But with Trump, Putin lost a golden opportunity to take an off-ramp. Yeah, I'm quite sure that with Trump, Putin would have had the capability of getting a deal that would have allowed the above strategy to still work. Yeah, I think so because Trump came in office with a massively pro-Russian perspective on this war, right? Out of a very surprisingly pro-Russian perspective. He halted aid to Ukraine. He claimed the president was not democratically elected. And he was generally a very pro-Russian stance. He wanted to reopen trade with Russia. He did not impose tariffs on Russia, despite imposing tariffs on every other country in the world. And so what happens now? He refused Trump's help and Trump's off-ramp. And so to the death, essentially, it's a continued unfavorable attritional grind and highly unpopular internationally and obviously for Ukraine bombing campaign, neither will result in a victory. How will any of these two strategies result in a victory? It's basically the war is lengthened in a way that can only result in either the Russian or Ukrainian states collapsing, right? Essentially, Putin went all in, just went all in, gambling that he has the better odds, and his gamble is actually, I think, I have far higher odds of winning this. I believe that the Ukrainian state is going to collapse first, that the support for Ukraine internationally is going to collapse first. And so my gamble is I can keep up this attritional warfare far longer, and the Ukrainian people will be the ones who will rise up against their state, clamoring for peace first before the Russian people do. Yeah, so that is currently his gamble, and in my view, it is a far riskier gamble than the above strategy, because in the above strategy, he might also lose power, right? Because they always say there is a reckoning after a war, but he could have definitely pulled it off as victory, as he did after annexing Crimea. And in the end, what do the Russian people have to say anyhow in Russia, right? The Russian people don't really have much of a say on how the country is run in the first place. So he could have pulled it off. In this scenario, on the long run, I think there's many areas that are trending against Putin and against Russia. The lethality is increasing. I don't think the bombing run is going to lead to a victory or to a surrender of the Ukrainians. I don't believe that. And I believe that support for Ukraine in the EU is increasing massively. Recently, Trump re-announced that he's opening up aid to Ukraine. NATO has increased their spending targets to 5%. A lot of that money is going to flow into purchasing weapons, which will be transferred to Ukraine. It's part of the NATO deal that any money sent to Ukraine is considered an increase in hitting that 5% target. And generally, I think that he should have gone for the upper strategy as opposed to taking this gamble. But let's see. I may be wrong. Maybe the bombing of Ukraine does result in someone toppling Zelensky and saying, okay, we give up, it's over. But that's just how I see it. If you liked this video, please like it. If you want to see more of this, like it, comment, and subscribe. I put a lot of work into this, into getting the data off of war spotting, analyzing it, making it graphical, making some conclusions. Also very interested in anything I said that you disagree with or agree with. Just let me know, and see you next time.